I'm a 21st century digital boy. I don't know how to read, but I got a lot of toys. My daddy's a lazy middle class.
The year is 2008-ish. I'd only recently got the second generation of iPhone, the 3G, which primed me to be amenable to an upgrade to my first or second generation video iPod, which was unfortunately stolen off my desk at work. So I waltzed into the Apple store with confidence and excitement about my new acquisition. I bought my brand spanking new iPod, whatever the current generation, video iPod, squirming with joy on the inside and probably outside at how much extra storage space this one had compared to the last one, how much more music and video downloads from iTunes I could have on there. But as I was walking out the door, I remember looking at the box just to check the system requirements, and I noticed that it required the next level up operating system at the time than what I had. And keep in mind, folks, these were the dark days of the late 2000s, before Apple graciously bestowed upon us the free upgrade of their miraculous operating systems straight from the cloud. You had to buy a disk at the store and do it manually. Well, I wasn't prepared for this, so I turned around, I marched back in there, and I asked the Apple genius people, so you're telling me that this thing that I just bought, I can't use unless I pay more money to make my computer be able to recognize it? And they just looked at me square in the eye and were like, yep. So I said, and I'm proud of myself for this, because I wasn't known for this type of behavior at the time, I said, I want my money back. Because even though I was really stoked on getting the latest version with more space, I was also familiar with sites that sold refurbished electronics, and I knew I could just settle for getting the same thing that I already had, that at least I knew would work with my current setup of my then PowerBook G4. I think it was 12-inch. 13-inch, something like that. The silver one. I had got that computer a few years before during my junior year in college, because even though they had Mac labs around my school, which was University of the Arts in Philadelphia, where I was studying screenwriting and film production, the cool thing to have, especially as an upperclassman, was your own computer, so you didn't have to sit there like a chump at all hours in the computer lab waiting for your movies to render on Final Cut. With your own computer, you could sit like a chump in the luxury of your own home waiting for Final Cut to render. For an average college student at the time, putting himself through school at a private art institution, almost exclusively on loans, which I'm still paying off, getting that PowerBook G4 at the time was a really major acquisition, and obviously I had to put it on a credit card. My first independent credit card, I believe. That was a very adulting thing to do. So I was still paying off that computer and that software for years to come. So even a couple years after college, I was not in the headspace to just keep throwing money at a company that was still taking my money for equipment that was working optimally. It was great relative to the time, of course. Growing up in the 90s, when Macs were around, but they came across as more of a novelty, obviously the more common and realistic way to go was Windows. And I was never a super tech head. I knew how to use and to upgrade my computer when necessary, but that was the era when upgrading just meant, oh, my computer is slowing down because I don't have enough RAM for what I'm trying to do. Upgrade the RAM. Better graphics card. I need a new motherboard. If you had even the baseline knowledge of what that stuff was and how to do it, which I know might sound crazy now because that was the days before YouTube could teach you how to do anything. Though I was lucky that my father at the time, who is a lifelong classical French horn musician professionally, which you can hear more about on episode 13 of the Musiccast side of this podcast, he was always looking for ways to supplement his income during those slow periods of working in the music business. And one of his side ventures was getting certified as a computer technician and network technician. So that definitely helped influence my comfortability with basic computer troubleshooting, repair, upgrading, that kind of stuff. So going into college, that's what I was used to. But then when I went to school in 2002, little did I know that that was the beginning of the Mac era. Apple was steadily making their way into the media production realm especially. So I was at first a little disconcerted and out of my league when I discovered that my school and similar institutions that were focused on arts and production were typically proudly Mac-based schools. That's not to say that people didn't use Windows and Linux-based stuff, but that was more the exception than the rule. It was intimidating at first because I don't think I had used a Mac since the early 90s in my elementary school days where our school library had that old classic Macintosh desktop with the green graphic monitor. And all I remember, and I think most people from my generation remember, is playing Oregon Trail on there. Otherwise, it was all Windows all the time. 3.1, 95, 98, 2000. So switching over to Mac OS was a little intimidating at first, but it was so user-friendly and intuitive that I caught on and got indoctrinated really quickly. And it didn't hurt that everybody was using it, mostly by default, because that's what the school offered. So I'm telling you this little anecdote because I'm trying to paint a picture of how disillusioning it was to have been so effortlessly turned to the other side from Windows to Mac, buying into all the hype, getting really comfortable with it, really feeling like they want their users to feel a special, unique part of the brand, identifying with it. I was an Apple guy through and through. Windows was passe. Windows didn't have Final Cut or GarageBand, and people had the audacity to tell me that Audacity was just as good. I was a total Apple shill up to that moment of realizing what their true business agenda really was: capitalism. And hey, call me naive, call me willfully ignorant, because that's all true and accurate. But at that time of my life, I really believed that giant corporations had their customers' best interests in mind, that they made products that they believed in, that they believed and consciously intended for them to have the best possible outcome for their consumers, so that their consumers would stick with their company and with their brand. I'm sorry, I'm an optimist. But I felt this way about everything. I thought that like cosmetics and the food industry and everything was, on our side, that they cared about us as people, as individuals, as customers. As a kid and young adult, I was just a typical consumer. But I'll never forget that moment walking out of that Apple store where it hit me like a ton of PowerBook G4s right on the head. Wait, they don't care about me. They just want my money. And in that moment, something shifted in my perspective. At first, it was disillusionment and resentment. But as I kind of reassessed and looked around at the other ways that I applied my previous philosophy of being a trusting consumer, my attitude became more of a, well, duh. And just to drive this point home, another example is all of the money and time and effort and pain that I willingly put myself through as a teenager and young adult trying to control my rampant acne. I tried every product that was sold to me on television, all the creams and wipes and even prescription medications, and all it did was make things worse until I stopped doing anything and eventually changed my diet and lifestyle. But still, you get the point. I just realized that most things we're told that we need, we don't. I know this may seem obvious now, but like I said, I was a very trusting and optimistic child. So since then, as time's gone on, I have never rejected any one company outright and felt justified to completely demonize or vilify them. I continued to get iPhones. I upgraded my Mac after my beloved, wonderful little PowerBook finally couldn't run any current software because it didn't have an Intel chip and couldn't upgrade to a current operating system. This was like maybe 2012 when I finally got rid of that thing. And it was still working. It worked great. It just couldn't keep up with all the modern demands. But the more sober place that I came to was just that, like I said, these companies don't care about me. They just want my money. So I am going to give my money to whatever I think is the best but most reasonably priced product that I can get for what I need. Not just because it purports to be the best, not because it's marketed as the coolest thing and you're like somehow lacking or subpar without it. I had an iPad for a while until I couldn't upgrade it anymore. But why am I telling you all this? And how does this actually relate to the topic of this podcast, which is adventuring? Well, I'm just trying to lay the groundwork for the context of why I just recently made some of the most heartbreaking decisions I had to make when it comes to staying current with some of my adventuring toys and tools. I talk more about this on a one-wheeling video that I did on my YouTube channel, which I'll link in the show notes. But long story short, essentially, I never really did any board sports except for dabbling a couple times growing up and in my young adulthood until I moved to Maui, learned how to surf, fell completely in love with the sport and the ocean and everything else involved, and then unexpectedly moved away from Maui back to the landlocked East Coast, where the pull of the ocean and water sports was just as strong, but not as available. So I did get a longboard skateboard, and I tried my hand at trick skateboarding a little bit. But once I discovered, and I was glad to have discovered, OneWheel early on, the first generation OneWheel, that only went like 3 miles and had maybe like an hour of battery life. That was like the mecca to me. That was the perfect toy and tool for somebody who didn't grow up boarding. So it had a lot more safety considerations in mind, like I could control my speed, and it had lights, unlike skateboards, but it also carved so effortlessly. It really was, to me, the next best thing to being on the water or being on the slopes. So here I am, indoctrinated into another company's tool and toy. I just thought the OneWheel was like the best thing under the sun. But then less than a year after I got my first one, they released the OneWheel Plus, and then it was not too long after that, then it was the XR and the Pint and then the GT. And going back to the whole Apple situation, this stuff was not cheap. The first 2 OneWheels I got were about $1,000. And then they just kept going up in price from there, especially to get the bigger ones. I know the Pints are cheaper, but they're also not as optimal for if you're trying to do longer distances and more off-road stuff. Even though I love the product, I saw the same writing on the wall that I did with Apple was once they have you hooked, they are going to keep pushing out new products, planning obsolescence with the old ones, and making you feel like lesser or lacking without having the newest, current, awesome thing. So after I got my Plus, and by the way, I got both of my OneWheels used because I couldn't afford them brand new. I could barely afford them used. I made a pact with myself that as long as the machines that I had were working and were safe, I wasn't going to get caught up in the whole upgrade culture with them. But there were some issues with having an older model. If I wanted to ride with people that had a newer model and a longer battery life, I was kind of out of luck because my battery was never going to last as long as theirs. So I discovered the DIY third-party market around this stuff, where I spent a bunch more money and installed a device that would allow cordless power tools battery to elongate the battery life. And there were all these other like aesthetic and ergonomic upgrades with better built like foot pads, and you could customize the rails and get like off-road tires and all this stuff, and I didn't get caught up in all that. As neat as all of it was just more and more upgrade money for something that I'd already paid what I felt was still a little too much for. Well, I had the OneWheel Plus for years, used it as much as I could. I really enjoyed it. Every time I was on it, I was filled with joy. It was always a thrill to ride. I even got rid of my analog skateboards because I just felt like, well, why would I ever ride these again when I have this optimal machine? Something I regret now. But I always had this underlying impending sense of anxiety around owning a product like this because I knew at some point it was either going to stop working or something was going to go bad on it, and it would either require repairs and or upgrades. Of course, just like any analog or electronic machine does. But it begged the question for me, the lingering question, what was I going to do when it did break or require more money to be put into fixing it than was worth fixing it just to keep nursing it along? Do I just throw it away or sell it for parts and just buy a brand new one and then go through that cycle again? I was already long since over that whole cycle with computers, smartphones, and basically everything else in our lives that has a computer chip. This is the era we're in now is, in my opinion, we're in the planned obsolescence era. Going back to what I said earlier, in the 90s, when you bought a computer from Office Depot, Best Buy, Circuit City, where I used to work back in the day before they went out of business, or just like, some local third-party retailer, or even like a flea market where I used to get laptops back in the day, you knew that you would have that computer indefinitely, and then every once in a while you would just upgrade it. More like a car, I guess, in that respect. But even then, cars are really frustrating investments for me, because every time I've had a car, there's always that underlying anxiety of, well, I know I'm going to have to put money into the upkeep of this thing, but at what point is that upkeep going to not be sustainable, and then I'll just have to trash it and just get a new one? I really hate that way of consumerism. I know it's inevitable. Anytime we have something that we use, eventually it's going to wear down, become obsolete, break, whatever. But I think there is a whole capitalist culture being built around that as like a given now. Not that the quality of the things is bad either. It's actually very good. Like Apple still builds great hardware that lasts indefinitely. OneWheels, like they say, are built like a tank. You can bash the living crap out of them and they will just keep going. But how does it help that company's bottom line if you buy something once and they can't guarantee a new sale from you at any given time? Now, don't even get me started with our subscription culture that we have going now. This is why, as broke as it's made me over the years, I still don't pay for music subscription services because I spent my youth and early adulthood collecting physical copies and then digital copies of music, like downloading from iTunes and Shockhound, if you remember that one. Those hot topics in like the early 2010s. Those were things that I owned. I know I didn't own the copyright to them, but I had access to it whenever I wanted. Now it's access whenever they allow it. But I don't want to go down that whole rabbit hole right now. I'm just saying that there's a pattern here. The writing is on the wall. And I know we're all just trying to kind of navigate it the best we can. I'm not trying to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I don't ever want to be a cynic that just rejects everything outright because it's not the way that I idealize it to be or think things should be. However, one thing that I keep coming back to, even though it's a trite thing to say in our days of bumper sticker philosophies, but I do believe in voting with our dollar because the only thing that really seems to matter to the bigger picture when it comes to economics, politics, business, even sociological things is money. And that sucks, but it's just the world that we live in. So I don't mind spending my hard-earned money on things that bring value into my life, like my OneWheel did. It was wonderful, but I knew that it had a shelf life. And the question was, just like with my Mac, with my iPod, with all of my smartphones, and now cars and appliances, what do I do when the thing I currently have doesn't work? The system in place says, well, just get a new one, get the latest one, get the best one, upgrade, upgrade, upgrade. But my gut, my experience, and my wallet say, hold on a second, this is a game that you're never going to win. So what I did in the past couple weeks, which is still a very raw wound, was I sold my OneWheel Plus on, I think it was Facebook Marketplace, and all of its accessories and everything that I had got, because I had like the flight fins that could help you ollie and the fangs, which would help the front of the board roll instead of just nosedive and throw you off. Because everything was working fine. Even my DIY third-party upgrades still going strong, which kept me from following my impulse to buy a newer one and a better one. So a couple generations have gone by since I got the original and the OneWheel Plus. I had sold the original to a friend a while ago because I didn't need it anymore because I had the Plus. But then the thing that then prompted the ever-present question of what am I going to do with this thing if it requires expensive repair or upkeep? Do I keep it, repair it, spend a bunch more money on it than I already have? Do I sell it and get a new one? Or do I just sell it and cut my losses? Well, I decided for now to just sell it, which is tough because I don't like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, like I said. I have regretted when I've done that before. For instance, when I was leaving Maui, I sold a lot of stuff that I had shipped out there because it was important to me, including my drum set. It was going to be expensive to send it back, and I just figured, well, I'll deal with that later, so I just sold it. And then I was without a drum set for a year and a half, and that was really hard. And like I said, I sold my skateboards that I had gotten when I moved to the mainland and couldn't surf very much anymore. So we're using those to supplement. And now that I don't have a OneWheel, I don't have my skateboards. So getting rid of the OneWheel was tough, but this leads me to an article, and the reason that this episode of the podcast have been generating for a while, but the tipping point to actually sitting down and doing it was this article that I came across, and I'll link it in the show notes, which is more than a year old, so it's a little outdated, but it's called The Scoop on Future Motion's Latest Self-Sabotage, and it was posted on April 2nd, 2022 by a blogger called One Rad Wheel, and it's a long article that gets into a lot of nitty-gritty, so I'm not going to get into all of it here, but a quick summary is just that it's a bit of an outside expose on Future Motion, which is the parent company of OneWheel, and how, as with a lot of tech companies, they are trying to corner the market on their patented product. So with OneWheel and Future Motion, it's the self-balancing skateboard technology, I guess. But they're not only doing it through their patent, they're also doing it through their lack of willingness to repair anything that has been messed with, even on like the smallest level, by the user or the third party. So like if you've opened up your OneWheel and unplugged the battery, that voids the warranty for repair. If you have sent it to a third party for repair, you can't send it back to them. It voids the warranty, etc. Also, it seems, at least as of when this was published, which again has been more than a year, and I don't know what their current practices are, but I wouldn't be surprised if they haven't changed very much, is they have a central repair pipeline. So they don't have like licensed or sanctioned third party places, which a ton exist that I've been hearing more and more about, through Facebook groups and stuff, people setting up their own e-board shops and rentals and repair. There's a lot of people just doing it out of their basement. But none of these people are sanctioned by Future Motion. So if anything has been done, basically you're like cut off. And then to make it worse, this really put a sour taste in my mouth, similar to the whole Apple situation that I went through, is how they're controlling the use of their products with firmware. Allegedly, on one of their later models, and I think Apple had an issue like this too, they were like throttling the battery life with a firmware update. So inherently, you can't upgrade your battery or your battery life or use it to its full potential without going through them and paying them more money. And this article gets into a bunch of other stuff related to all this, but it's hard to ignore the timing of coming across this article because I discovered it in the same 6 to 8 month time period that two things happened. One, my OneWheel tire finally stopped holding air. I knew it was only a matter of time. And from what I understand, replacing the tire on the thing, regardless of the whole warranty issue, because obviously it's not under warranty, it's so old, but even just returning it to OneWheel, which would cost a whole bunch of money, and then get the diagnostics and get it repaired would cost a whole bunch of more money. And I know I could get it done cheaply like DIY or get it done by somebody else, but either way, it was going to cost money to put into something that I've already put a bunch of money into, which I have no idea how long this thing is going to keep working, regardless of a flat tire. It's not like an old computer or a bike, which I used to road cycle a lot. And, you buy a frame and you would just fix things as they went. Because it's a computer, essentially, I know it's not going to last forever. And since they're in control of the software side of it, who's to say that they at some point won't just say, well, we're not going to support this anymore, and eventually your software is going to glitch because we're not sending out firmware patches and updates, which is something that also happened to my Chromebook recently, and I've had it happen to ones before. The planned obsolescence, yeah, it's old, but it works great. But then I got 6 months ago or whatever, I got a notification that by June it wasn't going to be able to be updated anymore. And then it has a link, so shop for current models of Chromebooks. And it's that same feeling I had when I tried to buy that iPod back in the day. It's like, oh, you have a thing that's working great? Too bad. Because we're in charge and we'll tell you when you need to get a new one. It's like everything's flipped. It used to be, I think, from what I remember, there was a time where I needed something and I would go get it from the people that provided it. Now, the people that are providing the stuff are telling us when we can and can't have it. And this isn't a new thing, I know, but it's still a frustrating thing. So my OneWheel was unusable without sinking more money into it. Also, I saw a Facebook ad, and I've been following e-water sports for a long time. So, there's OneWheels and e-boards are a whole huge growing community and business. Of course, there's the water side of it where there's like e-foils, electric surfboards and paddle boards and all that kind of stuff. And that price point was so egregious when I first discovered that about, 4 or 5 years ago. I was like, oh, this is really cool. Especially, like I said, for someone like me I'm landlocked from the ocean, but I do have lakes and rivers around. I was like, whoa, if I could carve a motorized surfboard, on my local river, how cool would that be? I wouldn't have to wait to go to the ocean and hope that there's waves, which there's usually not around here, to surf sporadically, if ever. So I was really excited about that prospect, especially having been indoctrinated onto the eskate OneWheel side of things. I was like all in on that idea for a long time, and I was following the technology and seeing, eventually, hopefully it would come down in price and become more average consumer available, just like I'm waiting for electric cars to do that, which they're vastly on their way. Something, by the way, that I know is going to have all the same issues of what I'm complaining about right now, but that or archaic combustion engine, it's a lesser of evils situation. I wish I didn't need a car at all, but here we are. But anyway, the e-surf stuff was so egregiously expensive that I was like, I'll just kind of put it on the back burner and keep an eye on it and just see where it goes. Well, this company called Boost Surfing that makes the Boost fins, which are detachable fins with a motor on them, hit my like Facebook feed or something, and I was like, oh, here it is. Like, I don't have to buy the whole board with this integrated system. You can just have the fin and put it on any board. This is what I've been waiting for. Like, now is my time to get into e-surfing and finally try my hand at it. But it was a Kickstarter. They had their first iterations out and their beta stuff going, but they didn't have it widely available yet. So I paid up front for when the wide release was available. And then I started seeing a lot of chatter, and I was on Facebook groups and Reddit and stuff. And they're like, I found the Kickstarter like 3 years ago and I've been waiting ever since. But then other people are like, oh, I got mine the next day. And, so I was like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to have to wait a while, but that's okay, because I'm really interested in this technology. Well, once the whole OneWheel thing happened a few months ago, and I realized that I knew I wasn't going to buy a new one, I was on the fence of repairing the one that I have because of its unknown longevity. I mean, it's old and it's only a matter of time before it stops working, especially, like I said, because of the software. I'm entrusting that thing with my life, trusting that it won't just throw me off of it or just stop working in the middle of like a super steep hill or something. It's a little scary to really think about, especially because it's, not fresh and new. I finally decided, all right, I think it's time that I draw a line in the sand here. And it was really tough because I knew that I was giving up an avenue of adventure and fun, but I'm also looking at it sustainably, and I'm looking at it with my experience as a consumer, and how frustrated I've been with these companies, not trusting their consumers, not trusting the quality of their products to speak for themselves, but trying to essentially trap us in this web of upgrades and planned obsolescence. So not only did I sell the OneWheel, but that decision made me rethink the boost fin decision. Since I still hadn't received mine yet, as much as I really, really wanted to try it and see how helpful it would be to somebody that loves to surf but doesn't get to do it very much, somebody that could utilize it on flat water in my local waterways, as excited I was about those prospects, I also realized if I got those, I would just be starting the same Ouroboros quandary that I got myself into by becoming an Apple guy and a OneWheel guy and whatever else. I would just be trading my money for the privilege of using someone else's hardware and software for as long as it worked or as long as they allowed me to, until it needed repair, upgrade, or replacement. And at this point, with everything else that I've put myself through with this kind of stuff, I've decided to avoid it for now. So I canceled my still not yet shipped order from Boost, and also rationalize it with the fact that there's, thousands of other people that are waiting for their orders that will probably get to use it a lot more than me anyway. Might as well give mine to a good home instead of mine probably not getting used as much as I would want it to justify the price of that kind of stuff. And instead, sticking to the more sustainable and analog things that I do have, like my mountain board, my kiteboard, which I still have yet to really learn how to do anything with, my paddle boards, kayak, surfboards. I have a lot of toys, and I have a lot of toys that only require repair when I don't use them properly, don't require upgrades, and are in no one else's control of when I can and can't use it except for me. This whole thing has helped me reappreciate what I do have, as opposed to ignoring what I have because there's always something new and shiny that they are trying to sell me. But modern technology, especially in the age of the microchip, has really not instilled the same sense of trust and sustainability, at least to me, that more traditional tools and toys and products once did. Which is, somebody has a good idea, they pour their heart and soul into making it the best they can, and they want you to believe in its quality and its value for you above all else. But even with all this said, I still don't feel like a technology rejecter. I don't see it as black and white. It's not all one thing or the other. It's not good or bad. It is just a tool. And there is a lot of value and importance in modern technology and a lot of good that comes out of it. But as a consumer, I am not feeling very constructive right now about giving my money to these companies that are acting more like puppeteers than providers of necessary goods and services. I'm not a non-believer, but I am a skeptic. I believe that there's use and value in this stuff, but not necessarily inherent, unquestionable necessity. For now, that's the lens that I'm going to use to look at this stuff. And meanwhile, like I said, enjoy what I do have. I know everybody has their own comfort level and take on this. I'm not at all trying to influence anybody's opinions or choices. As usual, I'm just relaying my experiences and how they've shaped and influenced my life and behaviors. And if that's any help or value to anybody, that's awesome. So I am really, really curious where you fall on this, what your experiences and opinions and other considerations that I didn't cover. Please let me know. If you go to breathingunderwater.us, you can comment on the main podcast page, any of my socials, YouTube. I'd love to hear from you and continue this conversation. So thank you so much for listening, and I will see you on the next one.